So let's create one more file. We'll copy the ID file, say 6th, and we'll try to work with class and ID together. Okay, let's open this file. All right, so let's have a green border. Let's create a green border of class, right? And then we're gonna have a red border as well. So I'm gonna have a red border of ID, green border of this, then we're gonna have italics of a class. Okay, so I'm mix and matching the IDs and class selectors. So this is nothing but the ID selector, then I have two class selectors, one red border as ID selector, green border as class selector, and italics as the class selector. Right, now let's remove all these other conditions that we have. Okay, and let's remove all these things. Let's understand the difference between ID and a class. Okay, one thing we know, if you want to apply a class, right, you can have green border. You can also have ID and class together, but you need to know which one will get executed. So if I say red border, okay, so when I have class and ID assigned to one HTML tag, you can see the red border has been assigned. Okay, it's here, right? You can see the differences. The red border has been assigned. It doesn't match which preference you write it. Means if you write it like this, it doesn't really matter the sequence, but ID has more preference than class. Means if you have class and ID and you have a rule that has been applied in class and ID, the ID takes the preference. If the rule is same, then ID take the preference of applying that rule. Okay, that's one difference that you have to understand between ID and a class. You know, if you have a class, you can have multiple selectors, and if you have ID, it says red border, right? So you can see the italics is still applied. That's basically the green border has been replaced with the red border because there is a clash between the same rules, same properties. So it takes the higher preference of the property for ID, and then the text italics have no clash, so it's just applied the text italics. So it is taking all the rules, then it's doing some kind of comparison between ID and a class, and the ID rules applied first, then whatever is the leftover of all the rules that has been applied onto the HTML tags. Right, so remember these two most important difference. ID has more preference than class, and if you have ID and a class, all the additional rules that you have will be applied onto the HTML tags. Okay, that's why you see text italics is been applied even though ID has more preference over the class, because ID doesn't talk about text italics. Okay, that's one of the classic differences between ID and a class.